A few months ago, I participated in a game jam on Itch called the Global Moon Jam. This jam's theme ended up being time. During the brainstorming for my project, I had decided I wanted to incorporate outer space into my game to go along with the jam being called Moon Jam. My idea was to make a roguelite crafting game, where the player needs to repair their ship by building parts as well as purchasing upgrades to help along the way. To obtain the parts for the ship, the player would need to collect ore off of slain enemies through rifts. These rifts are traveled to from the player hub. To make it more interesting than just destroying the aliens and grabbing the ore off of them, I came up with the idea of a collector that the player would need to bring each ore to make a deposit. To bring in the theme of time, the idea is that these rifts only have a short link back to the hub, and after the time runs out, the player is instantly teleported back to the hub with any of the ore that they happen to have deposited. If the player happened to die in one of these rifts, it would void out any ore deposited for that run and just respawn them back in the hub. I was really happy with how this project turned out and wanted to expand it out further. After a bit of brainstorming, I decided I wanted to start it over with having it fully planned out so I could incorporate a lot more systems without the project and code becoming super messy and the code becoming too confusing for me to follow. During the planning phase for this new version, I used a website called Milano. This website lets you plan out everything with a visual-based system where you can create boards for everything and connect them in a way that visually makes sense to you. This visual system helped me keep the planning really organized, as I was able to have the boards inside of boards to be able to have key things have their own sections. While doing this planning phase, it was suggested by Nathan of Nathan Audio that we could possibly switch the project to 2.5D. I have always actually been really fascinated with 2.5D games, and one of my early planned projects before I even really knew how to make games was going to be in that style. With this new perspective change, we had to make some choices about how the camera and movement would work, so I started to make a small prototype. The first thing I had to figure out was how to properly display the sprites in 3D space. The solution to this is called billboarding, so I did a few Google searches on how to billboard the sprites and implemented it into a script I could toggle the billboard off and on with. Originally, the camera was a fixed view, slightly pulled back and almost top down, but at enough of an angle to create a sense of 3D depth. This effect was really cool, but something was missing. With everything being in 3D space, the lack of shadows was unnatural. Fortunately, Unity has a fairly easy way to light sprites by going into the debug of the sprite itself and just clicking the option. While this small test scene worked and looked pretty cool, I kept finding myself wanting to be able to pan the camera around, so I added a simple camera controller. But this produced a new problem. With the billboarding script, the sprite always faces the camera, so when panning the camera around, the player would always face the camera instead of being in the position the player was facing. A way around this is to billboard the sprites but change the sprite depending on the position of the camera in relation to the player. When trying to figure out how to make this work, I ran into a new problem. The movement of the player was getting thrown off depending on the camera position, as I had not made the billboard script to take the movement into consideration with the camera position. After a few days of trying to figure this out on my own, it was suggested to check out the asset store if there's anything we could use. I ended up finding an asset called SpriteMan 3D, and it actually happens to have a free version along with the paid. While looking through the videos of it being used, there was no real video of it showing being used the way we were wanting to, so I grabbed the free version and read up on the documentation. After setting up the plugin with my current player, the effect actually worked rather well, and would work for what we needed for now, with plans on upgrading to the paid version to use 8-way sprites down the line. Now I had to move back to the movement problem, as even though this plugin did come with a movement script, it was not going to work with our style of game and what we needed it to do. Since at this point, we knew we were going to be doing a third-person camera system, I decided to bring in the Unity starter asset for a third-person controller, and following a great tutorial by CodeMonkey, I was able to convert it to just what we needed for this project. I ended up running into a small hiccup with switching to this movement script instead of the one the asset was bundled with, as it would not trigger any of the animation states that the SpriteMan asset was looking for. I spent a bit looking through the documentation and found the code I would need to implement in our current movement to make the animations trigger. After all of this was done, things were already starting to look really cool, and I started to have a lot of other ideas. One of the bigger things I needed to figure out was how to light the sprites. Because they are in 3D and with shadows that I enabled earlier, the sprites not responding to the lights in the environment was jarring to my eyes and had to be fixed. After watching a few YouTube videos and some Google searches, I ended up finding the sprite shader on a thread from one of the Google searches. So knowing that I would need to use the shader graph, I upgraded the project to the HDRP. Once the shader was built and saved, I put it on the sprite, and an undesired result happened. Because of how we were billboarding the sprites to allow for 3D movement with a panning camera, the sprites' faces end up changing from front to back at times, and this was causing some horrible lighting problems on the sprite. This was fixed by changing how the shader works as far as tangent and world space, and with that, my small prototype of how it may look was done. Once this prototype was finished, I decided I was really happy with the 2.5D style and the new life it could bring into the project. It was time to start coding the different systems needed for the game. The first thing I chose to work on was the crafting of objects. I decided I wanted to use scriptable objects in this project, as up until now I actually hadn't used them in any of my projects. After watching a few YouTube videos and feeling I had a good grasp on the concept, I made a simple ore and material script that housed things like the sprite, item name, and a few other details. I also made a manager to go along with the ore and the materials. I made prefabs for each ore and material type, and then moved on to making the pickup script so they had some functionality. While it was nice to be able to collect the ore, there needed to be more of a visual representation as to what had been picked up, so I decided to add text that would spawn above every time you grabbed something. With the very basics in, it was time to bring in a save system before things became too complex, so I could keep track of anything that needed to be in that save system. While working on my last update for my project from June, Remainder Matters, I ended up adding a save system for the first time, so I went over to the scripts from that project and brought them into this one. After a bit of a hassle getting it all set up again, the saving and loading was working, and I could move on to the next thing. I decided to work on the UI next. Instead of it being on the screen all the time, I wanted to make it a toggle that could be opened and closed to look at the currently collected ore, so I added the input to the action map and set up the toggle, and also added updates to the text fields if ore is collected. With lots of things needed to be done on the back end, I chose to take a detour from the ore collecting and started to work on the combat itself. Originally in the Game Jam version, the firing was automatic, where it would just keep shooting based on whatever direction you were facing. With the game being in third person this time, it didn't feel right to have it just keep shooting, so instead the choice was made to make it more like a traditional third person shooter. While setting this up, the only way to make the shooting feel really good was to have it as an over the shoulder camera, but I really wanted to have the camera out farther for the player. Fortunately, Unity has a really cool asset for managing cameras called Cinemachine. This allowed for toggling between two different cameras depending on the actions, so the player can actually zoom in to the shoulder view and then zoom back out. This effect looked really cool, but it did cause a slight bug with the billboarding, where if the player would jump while zoomed in, it would actually tilt their character. This was fixed fairly easy by locking the rotations while the on-ground bool was false. And with that, the third-person combat was working and I was ready to jump back into the resource collecting. In the original game, one of the bigger things about how resources were handled was the depositing mechanic inside of the rifts. So I made a prefab for the ore collector and gave it a script that would handle giving the values to the deposit text, as well as instantiating the floating text when a resource is collided with it. Another part of bringing in the resource collector is the need to be able to actually grab the resource and bring it over to it. I achieved this by adding a sprite holder to the player that is empty and an array of sprites. When the player collides with an ore or mat, it switches the sprite holder to the corresponding sprite in the array. And instead of giving the values for the ore mat manager on pickup, nothing else actually happens until the player collides with the ore deposit. One of the things when planning this project is the idea of having the rifts be far more expanded and being procedurally generated. Because of this, the size is going to be much larger, so the harvester actually has to be movable instead of being tied to one location. So now instead it actually can be picked up and dropped around the environment, so you can kind of like drop it and grab the clumps of resources and put it back in. All in all, I'm really happy with what I've accomplished in the past 2 weeks since starting the project, and really look forward to fleshing this out even more over the next few months. Thanks for sticking around for the first log about my game. More logs on the game are coming every Thursday, but until then, see you next week.